It was a cold, quiet night, the kind where even the stars seemed to hide behind thick clouds. The long stretch of empty road curved through a forest, silent except for the hum of tires against cracked pavement. The man behind the wheel, tired and hungry, had been driving for hours with no sign of life around. His stomach growled, and his eyes scanned the roadside for any glow of civilization. That's when, like a miracle, a flickering red neon sign appeared in the distance, its letters spelling out, "Millie's Diner, open 24/7. Relieved, he pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. Not a single car was in sight. The building looked frozen in time, like a diner from the 1950s, with checkered floors and chrome accents that had lost their shine. Something about it felt out of place, too still, too clean, as if no one had entered it in years, yet it looked freshly scrubbed. With his stomach twisting in hunger, the man stepped out of the car and walked toward the glowing entrance. A bell chimed as he opened the door, a soft jingle that echoed too long in the still air. The warmth inside was strange, dry, almost lifeless, and colder than expected. The smell of bacon and old coffee hung in the air, familiar, yet oddly sharp. Behind the counter stood a woman in a spotless uniform. Her name tag said, Millie. Her smile was wide, too wide, and her eyes stayed locked on him without blinking. She spoke in a sweet but unnatural tone, saying, "Sit anywhere, honey. We've been waiting for you." The words hit him wrong, but he brushed it off. Maybe it was just small-town charm, he thought. He walked to a booth near the window and slid into the red vinyl seat, which let out a squeak that echoed strangely. In the near-empty room, a menu was already placed on the table. The pages were worn, but the photos of the food seemed off, colors too bright, meat that looked too smooth, eggs that had an odd plastic shine. Before he could study it further, Millie approached the table again. Without asking for his order, she announced with a grin, "You look like a meatloaf guy. I'll bring you the house special." Before he could protest, she turned and walked away, her shoes making no sound on the tile floor. That's when he noticed the cook behind the service window. A tall, motionless figure stood in the shadows of the kitchen, face pale under the dim lights. The man stared at him, unblinking, unmoving, as if carved from stone. A chill ran down his spine. He gave a small wave, but the cook did not react. It was like being watched by a statue. Trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, he turned, his attention back to the menu. But something deep in his gut whispered that he should have never stopped at this diner. Something was very wrong with this place, and it was only just beginning. The old booth creaked softly under the weight of the traveler as he shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the strange menu and the unsettling silence of the diner. A single ceiling fan spun above, its blades turning too slowly, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghostly hands reaching out. At the far end of the room, the jukebox flickered but played no music. Something about the diner didn't feel alive. It felt preserved, like an exhibit in a forgotten museum. Moments later, Millie returned, holding a steaming plate in her hands. Her smile was unchanged, still wide, still stuck in place like a mask. Without a word, she placed the plate in front of the man. The meatloaf sat in a thick brown gravy, flanked by mashed potatoes that were too smooth, too white, almost like they had been piped from a bag rather than scooped by hand. The vegetables on the side were colorless, dull green beans that looked as if they had been boiled for hours. Something about the food didn't feel fresh. It looked staged. Millie stood there for a moment, watching him closely. Her eyes never blinked. Her breathing was too slow. Then, as if remembering some forgotten chore, she turned without another word and walked silently back toward the counter, vanishing behind the swinging kitchen doors. That was when his gaze wandered once more to the small service window at the back. The cook stood there exactly as before, rigid, silent, eyes locked on him like a predator watching prey from behind glass. Not once did the figure shift. No movement, no sign of breath. Just a pale face and cold eyes, full of something not quite human. A nervous glance around the diner revealed something strange. The lights above only flickered slightly now, casting a dim yellow hue over the black and white tile floor. There were no sounds outside. No passing cars, no insects, not even the whisper of wind. Just silence, thick and unnatural. His eyes were drawn back to the photos on the far wall, dozens of black and white snapshots in old wooden frames. Smiling families, young couples, travelers sitting in the very booth he now occupied. At first, they seemed like any ordinary photos found in a local diner. But then the truth crept in. The same people appeared again and again in different pictures, wearing the same clothes, striking similar poses, never aging. A chill slid down his spine as realization set in. These weren't just customers. They were the same customers. Trapped, somehow in time. Frozen in memory. Before panic could fully form, something else caught his eye. Something impossible. Near the center of the wall, in a slightly newer frame, was a photo of someone sitting in this exact booth. Same jacket, same face, same moment. The man in the photo was him, but he had never been here before. That was certain. And yet the picture had captured him perfectly, as if it had been taken only moments ago. The diner was no longer just strange. It was wrong. Deeply, dangerously wrong. A cold shiver ran down the man's spine as he stared at the photo on the wall. It was him, sitting right where he was now, in the very booth. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm, telling himself it was just a strange coincidence. He wasn't sure what to do next. His stomach growled again, louder this time, reminding him of the meatloaf sitting in front of him. He didn't want to eat it. He couldn't. But the hunger gnawed at him, and he figured he would just have a few bites, then leave and forget this odd place as quickly as possible. He picked up the fork and stabbed the meatloaf, but when he brought it to his mouth, he hesitated. It didn't feel right. The texture was off, too firm, almost like the meat had been overcooked. But still hungry, he cut another piece and took a bite. At first it tasted fine, but then he felt something wrong, something metallic. He looked down at his plate, and what he saw made his stomach churn. The meatloaf, which should have been moist and rich in color, was now darker than he had expected, and the gravy wasn't brown at all. It was red. Blood red. He pushed the fork away, his hand shaking. He stared at the plate, horrified. The meatloaf wasn't cooked. It wasn't even meat. It looked more like something from a nightmare, something that shouldn't be on a plate in front of a person. The red liquid wasn't gravy. It was blood, fresh, thick, still dripping from the meatloaf. His mouth went dry and his heart hammered in his chest. Without thinking, he shoved the plate away from him, backing up in his seat, his breath coming in quick gasps. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but something about the diner kept him frozen. The silence pressed down on him, suffocating him, as if the air itself was thick with something that didn't belong. Millie's voice broke through the haze, calm and unnerving as ever. "Is it not to your taste?" she asked, her voice sweet, but carrying an undercurrent of something darker, something menacing. He could barely look at her, but he managed to mumble that he wasn't feeling well, that he needed some water. She just smiled, that same empty, wide smile, and nodded slowly before walking away toward the counter. But as she turned her back, he saw something in the corner of his eye. The cook, standing in the kitchen window. He hadn't moved, not even a single inch. His eyes were still, locked on the man, unwavering. It was like the cook was a statue, but the cold feeling in the man's chest told him it was far from that. He wanted to run, to get up and leave, but the diner felt like it had already taken hold of him. The door that had once been an exit now felt like a distant dream. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay, or if he'd even be able to leave. The feeling of being trapped grew heavier with each passing second, and the blood-soaked meatloaf sat in front of him like an unspoken warning. As the man sat there frozen in his booth, his mind raced through a storm of thoughts. His breath came in shallow, frantic bursts. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the plate of blood-soaked meatloaf, nor could he shake the feeling that the diner itself was alive, watching him. Millie's smile, her eerily calm demeanor, the cook in the kitchen, all of it felt wrong, out of place. He felt as though he had walked into a trap, one that he couldn't see but could definitely feel, closing in on him. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as he tried to steady his shaking hands. The air in the diner grew heavier, thicker. It pressed down on him, suffocating him. It wasn't just the food or Millie's strange presence. It was everything. It was the whole diner, as if it had an energy of its own, an unseen force that held him in place. And then the voices started. At first, they were soft, barely audible whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The sound was faint, like a distant conversation that he couldn't quite make out. He thought maybe he was imagining it, the stress of the situation, playing tricks on his mind. But as he strained his ears to listen, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words, just strange murmurs and hisses, almost like voices from another world, speaking in an ancient language that sent chills up his spine. He glanced nervously around the diner, but Millie was still at the counter, the same, smile glued to her face as she polished the empty glasses. The cook was still standing behind the kitchen window, unmoving, as always. But it was the walls, those walls covered in old, faded photographs, that seemed to be alive now. The pictures began to warp and shift, their colors darkening, the smiling faces twisting into grimaces of pain, their eyes pleading for help. It was as if the people in those photos knew something the man didn't, but they couldn't speak. They couldn't reach him, and he couldn't reach them. Their silent cries echoed in his mind. A sudden draft ran through the diner, stirring the air and carrying with it a sharp, metallic smell, like blood. He shuddered and looked back, at the meatloaf on his plate. The blood, thick and dark, was now starting to congeal, forming patterns that looked too deliberate to be random. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, creeping into his thoughts. They weren't just coming from the walls anymore. They were in his head, swirling around his mind like a swarm of bees, pushing him to do something, anything, to escape. Then, a voice broke through the madness, clear and cold. It wasn't Millie's, nor was it the cook's. It came from everywhere. "Leave," it hissed. The man's heart stopped. He shot to his feet, knocking the chair backward. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The whispering voices continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Leave now," the voice commanded again, more urgent this time, as if the diner itself was alive, angry that he had stayed too long. His feet moved instinctively toward the door, but the air grew thick, pushing him back. Something unseen was holding him in place. The door seemed so far away, a distant hope, yet it felt more like a trap. Would he make it out? Or was he already too late? Panic surged through the man's body as the whispers grew louder, relentless, filling his mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. His feet were rooted to the floor, unable to move, even though every instinct screamed for him to run. The door was still in sight, just a few steps away, yet it felt as if it had drifted miles from him. The air in the diner thickened, pressing against him, as though the very walls of the place were alive and intent on trapping him. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the thick silence that surrounded him. The faint, sweet smell of food, now mixed with something far worse. Something foul, almost rotting, seeped into his senses, making him feel dizzy and nauseous. Millie's voice echoed from behind him, smooth as ever, but laced with an undercurrent of something darker. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her words soft, almost coaxing, as though she knew something he didn't. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, he noticed her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on him with an intensity that felt like a predator watching its prey. There was no warmth in that smile anymore, only a cold, cruel gleam. "You can't leave," she said, her tone no longer sweet, but sharp, cutting through the still air. "You're already part of it now." The man's heart raced as he took a step back, his body shaking uncontrollably. The walls seemed to move closer, their dark corners swallowing the dim light, stretching the shadows in unnatural ways. The photos on the wall had changed. The people in them weren't just smiling anymore. They were reaching out, their hands clawing at the edges of the frames, as though trying to break free. Some of their faces had turned skeletal, their eyes hollow and empty, and others were twisted in agony. The diner was no longer a place of rest or comfort. It had become a tomb, a place where time stopped, where the living and the dead collided. His pulse pounded in his ears as he took another step back, trying to find a way to escape. But the door, the exit, that once seemed like the solution too. His terror was now an impenetrable force. The closer he got to it, the further it seemed to move away. Desperation clawed at his chest as the walls closed in, squeezing the air from his lungs. His legs gave way beneath him and he collapsed to the floor, unable to breathe, unable to think clearly. Millie appeared beside him, her face so close now that he could see the faint traces of something dark behind her eyes, something ancient, something not human. "You thought you could leave, but there's no leaving here," she whispered, her breath cold against his skin. "This diner is a part of you now. You'll never escape." A low, guttural growl echoed from the kitchen, pulling his attention toward the cook. The figure was moving now, stepping out from behind the counter, his face more distorted than ever. His skin had taken on a sickly gray hue, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light, fixed on the man with a hunger that was terrifying to behold. The cook's mouth opened, but no words came out, only a deep, bone-chilling growl that seemed to vibrate the very walls. The man scrambled backward, pushing himself up, his eyes wild, searching for any way out. But there was none. The walls seemed to bend and twist, trapping him in a nightmare where escape was impossible. The diner had claimed him, and there would be no leaving. The man's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling violently with the panic that had taken over his body. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something malevolent closing in on him from all sides. The walls, now, pulsating with a life of their own, seemed to hum with an eerie energy that vibrated through his very bones. The images on the walls no longer looked like photographs. They had transformed into living, breathing entities, their eyes following him, their faces twisted in torment. The diner, once a simple roadside stop, had become a nightmare that stretched, beyond reason, beyond reality. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Each second that he spent in this place was another piece of his soul being drained away. Millie's voice, sweet and hypnotic, echoed in his mind as she moved closer, her figure casting a long shadow across the room. "There's no escaping," she murmured, her words now almost a chant. "You've been chosen. You're part of the diner now. Forever." Her smile stretched wider, impossibly so, and her eyes gleamed with an unnatural, chilling light. The man tried to back away, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He stumbled, falling against the table as the heavy, suffocating air around him seemed to tighten its grip. The cook stepped forward, his twisted form emerging from the shadows. His face, once human, now seemed to be a grotesque mask of decay. The man's eyes locked onto the cook's, and what he saw was not just hunger, it was something far worse. It was an emptiness, a void that had consumed the very essence of this being, turning him into something unrecognizable, something that no longer belonged to this world. The cook's lips curled back into a grin, exposing teeth that were far too sharp, far too many. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the man, his shadow swallowing the diner as he moved. The man tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, suffocating him. A voice, low and menacing, echoed in his mind again, and this time he recognized it as his own. He had heard these whispers before, in the corners of his mind, in the deep recesses of his memory. The diner was feeding off him, drawing from his fear, his desperation, and now there was no way to break free. He had been lured in, tricked into believing he could escape, but the diner was a prison, and he was its latest victim. The darkness in the diner deepened, and the man felt his strength fading. His body grew weaker, the air thicker, heavier with each passing moment. The walls seemed to breathe around him, pulsating with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Millie's laugh rang out, sweet and cruel, as she slowly circled him, her steps silent on the cold, hard floor. The cook stopped in front of him, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. "You're here to stay," the cook said in a voice that was both guttural and smooth, a voice that felt like it was coming from within his own head. The man's mind screamed for escape, for any way out, but it was too late. The diner had claimed him, and no one had ever left once they had entered. The curse of the diner was eternal, and now it was his to bear. Time no longer held meaning as the man stood frozen in place, unable to escape, unable to break free from the suffocating grip of the diner. The air had turned thick with a stench of decay, the shadows creeping along the walls as though alive, watching him. His eyes flickered toward the door, but it was no longer a door. It had become a faded, distant memory, unreachable, like everything else that once offered a chance for freedom. Millie's laughter echoed in the room, its sweetness now a mocking sound, an insidious reminder that hope had long since died in this place. The man tried to speak, to scream, but his voice had been stolen by the overwhelming power that the diner had over him. His throat felt raw, as though the air itself had clamped down around him, stifling every attempt to break the silence. He turned his head toward the cook, whose twisted face seemed to grow darker with every passing moment, his eyes glowing with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The cook's mouth parted, revealing the rows of sharp teeth that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide, and he spoke, his voice low and cold, sending a chill deep into the man's bones. "It's time for the final feast," the cook whispered. Suddenly, the man felt something cold press against his chest. He looked down to see a large plate of food placed before him, just like the meal he had tried to eat earlier, only this time, it was far worse. The meatloaf was no longer just covered in blood. It seemed to pulse, the dark red liquid moving as though alive, dripping from the edges of the plate. His stomach twisted in revulsion, but his body refused to respond, held in place by an invisible force. He stared at the plate, the horrible, sickening sight before him. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. "Eat," they urged, their voices dripping with malice. "Eat, and you'll become one of us." Millie was at his side now, her smile still stretched wide, as though this moment was some kind of celebration. Her eyes gleamed with the same unsettling glow as the cook's. "You're a part of the diner now," she said, her voice saccharine sweet but laced with something far darker. "Eat, and you'll never leave. You'll be with us forever, the How." Man's heart hammered in his chest as he fought to control the rising nausea in his stomach. The whispers filled his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a tightening noose. The plate of food seemed to glow in the dim light, as though it had some kind of power over him, compelling him to obey. He knew that if he ate, he would be trapped. Forever. Just like the others in the pictures on the walls, their eyes pleading for release, their faces frozen in eternal torment. But there was no choice. The diner had claimed him. It had drained him of his will, of his strength, and now it demanded that he partake in its cursed feast. As he picked up the fork, his hand shaking, he knew the truth. He was no longer a man. He was just another soul, another lost victim swallowed by the diner's insatiable hunger. The moment the fork touched his lips, everything went dark. The walls, the faces, the figures. Everything faded away as the diner's curse consumed him whole. And in that moment, the whispers stopped. The feast had begun, and the diner had claimed another soul to add to its eternal hunger.